So today we come to day 3 and day 4 of creation. Let me read the passage of Scripture out of Genesis. It begins in verse 9, Genesis 1, verse 9. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered water he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. So on day 3, we have land and sea. Everything has changed on the earth since creation. But on the third day, God created the land and the sea, and the waters were created, as you remember, on the first day. Okay, the waters were created on the first day. On the second day of creation, water was divided. The water that is below and the water that is above. And in between those two was an expanse, or an expansion, or space that is in between the two bodies of water. So on the third day, God gathers the waters under the expanse into one place. And what exactly does that mean? Verse 9 says that God gathered it together, okay? But what does that mean? It means several things. Number one, it seems to mean that the topography of the earth was very different from the post-flood topography that we know as planet Earth today. Everything changed with the catastrophic flood that occurred in Noah's day. Different study. Right now I'm in the process of doing that study with the men's group. But the shape and the appearance of the crust of the earth is very, very different now than it was. Secondly, probably the majority of all the earth, I actually think that all of the earth changed. The crust was replaced during the flood. Science tells us actually that the seas dropped, and as the seas dropped, it pushed land up, that the makeup of the bottom of the seas is a very heavy material with the consistency, the weight of somewhere between lead and mercury, both being very heavy, and the consistency of the crust of the earth is more like the weight of aluminum. So what sits on the crust is very lightweight. What sits at the bottoms of the oceans is very heavy, and the oceans dropped during the flood, and that pushed the land up and created really the mountain ranges as we know them today. Everything changed during that time. As a result of that, we know then that even the Garden of Eden is no more. Sometimes people wonder, well, where was the Garden of Eden? Or where is the Garden of Eden? Well, it isn't, okay? It's gone. Wherever it was, we will never know. Even the topography of the earth has changed. And so it's really a waste of time trying to figure out exactly where it was. A third thing is that at this point of creation, there was probably more land than there was sea. I put on the screen a picture of a single continent, and there probably was a single continent because the Bible says that the seas were gathered together into one place. Today, there are a multitude of seas, of oceans that are around the earth, but the terminology of the Bible here is that the seas were gathered together into one single place. And there was probably more land than there was sea at this particular time, whereas today there is more sea than there is land as a result of the earth splitting open at the time of the flood. the waters gushing up from the fountains of the deep. More water was present on the surface of the earth after the great flood. And people often wonder, where did the flood waters go? Okay, let me explain that to you. Before I do that, though, you're looking at a single continent, what is often called Pangaea. And in 1859, there was a Christian scientist by the name of Antonio Snyder. If you look him up on Wikipedia or anywhere on the internet, he's an American, but he's always referred to as a Frenchman wherever you go. And the reason that he's referred to as a Frenchman, he was a Christian from America who was the first man to really take a look at the continents and say, wait a minute, this looks like a jig puzzle to me, and all of these pieces fit together. And so he did a lot of study and a lot of work on that, wrote a book, and he couldn't find a publisher for it. And finally, in 1859, a publisher in France published it, and hence he's always been known as a Frenchman, okay? But he's really an American, and he's a Christian. That's the interesting thing. He's a Christian. And he saw that the continents all fit together like a jig puzzle, and he believed that they broke apart during the time of the flood, just exactly what I believe today. But that was back in 1859. Now, also, if you remember, in 1859 is when Charles Darwin was publishing his book, and so there was a lot of disagreement going on in the world in those days, and Antonio Snyder kind of got lost for a long time, is kind of experiencing a revival in these days. But the question becomes then, where did the water go? The Bible tells us that the water during the flood covered the entire earth. It says specifically it covered the mountains, and the Hebrew word mountain does not necessarily mean an enormous mountain peak like Denali or the Himalayas, but the word can be translated for in any high point, any summit, any hill, a high hill of any sort. I actually believe that most of the mountains as we know them today were created during the flood. If you notice, the mountain ranges tend to run along fault lines, which is where the earth cracked and molten rock came pouring out from below and formed most of the mountain ranges during that particular time. But still, people wonder, and skeptics, and especially old earth people and evolutionists, they kind of laugh at Christians and say, well, if there was really a flood, where did all that water go? You remember Jacques Cousteau? Jacques Cousteau, okay, was on TV for years and years and years. I remember one time he even came to Kodiak when I was there. At least his ship did, his boat did. I forget what, the Calypso or something like that. Calypso, that's what it was. And we were. It was just fun to look at it, okay, and to think, hey, he must be here. But he did an awful lot of underwater research in his lifetime. Jacques Cousteau, who is a evolutionist, who is an old earth person, Jacques Cousteau says that if you shaved off all the land, all the high hills, they would drop into the oceans and completely disappear, and the water would cover the earth to a level of 10,000 feet. Jacques Cousteau says that basically all of land could disappear right now today in the ocean trenches, and that there would be 2 miles of water. The Bible only says that the water covered the earth by 20 feet, 15 cubits is what we're told in Genesis. So Jacques Cousteau says that's absolutely possible based on his own research, and in fact it is. The ocean trenches are way deeper, some of them way deeper than the mountains are high, and it is interesting to think that all of land could disappear. The water is still here. The water from the flood didn't go anywhere. It is still here on earth. And so that's the answer to that problem, okay? Genesis tells us that the waters rose, and they rose and covered everything, and I believe that. So the fourth thing that is different, okay, or if you remember, number one, the pre-flood topography was different than it is today. Number two, the Earth's crust changed during the flood. Number three, there was probably more land than sea before the flood. And then number four, there was this supercontinent that broke apart during the time of the flood. During the flood, the continents moved apart very, very, very rapidly. Now, old Earth people and evolutionists don't believe that, but Christians have their scientists too. And it's amazing the research that's going on today, and we're realizing that this continental drift is more of a myth, and in fact, there was a continental thrift that took place during the flood, and there was a rapid moving apart of the continents, breaking apart of those continents on the fault lines. Not the slow plate tectonic thing that we know today. In fact, volcanoes that occur today are the aftermath of what started during the flood. Tsunamis, the aftermath of what started during the flood. The movement of the continents is just the settling of what started during the flood, okay? That's when everything began, and we're still suffering or feeling the effects of what God did on planet Earth during the time of the flood. One of the things that I find interesting is to look at the Atlantic Ocean and the continents that are on either side of it. Scientists have actually looked at this and realized that there clearly was a time when America and Europe and South America and Africa sat together. In fact, has anybody ever walked the Appalachian Trail? Or been on parts of it? Okay. What's interesting is that the Appalachian Trail goes from Georgia to Maine, but it continues on up into Canada. But in the 2000s, what's interesting is that the Appalachian Trail has been extended, and it's been extended in places like Scotland and Iceland and Norway and Sweden and even down into Africa, because scientists understand that at one time all of that went together, and they've discovered that the makeup of the mountain ranges on either side of the Atlantic Ocean are the same. The fossil layers are the same. They were at one time together there, and they broke apart and separated. So scientists that believe in this rapid movement of the continents, scientists have actually done some research and believe that the continents move from being a supercontinent, one continent, to being divided as we know them today, probably in 25 days. Now, when you think about that, and you read the story of the flood in Genesis, and you see the turmoil that was going on the earth, there was no just casual, gentle rising of the tide. That's not what we're reading about. We're reading about the fountains of the deep breaking forth, spewing up water and steam and lava and all kinds of things. And the ark was designed, as it was designed, to ride low in the water, and by and large to be able to handle any kind of hurricane-type storms that it was going to encounter, and it did. Imagine these large continents moving at the distance, thousands of miles, in a space of about 25 days, and what that would do to the water, and the sloshing of the water around the globe. And it was just a major catastrophic event that took place. So back to the Garden of Eden. So where is the Garden of Eden? Well, we know, and I remember as a boy sitting down and reading about the Garden of Eden, and there are 4 rivers that are mentioned. There's a river that flows out of the garden, and there are 4 rivers that it flows into. And while we don't know about 2 of them, the other 2 we seem to know something about, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so is it possible that the Garden of Eden was somewhere in Mesopotamia, and because of the existence of the Tigris and Euphrates River? Well, no. In fact, we cannot draw that conclusion. We have no idea where on earth the Garden of Eden was, nor do we have any idea that that part of the earth is still above the surface of the water. And we certainly know that it just does not exist today. But was it near the Tigris and the Euphrates? No. There were 4 rivers, and the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates are the 4 rivers that are mentioned. Those rivers are gone forever. The Tigris River, as we know it today, and the Euphrates River, as we know it today, are not the rivers that were called the Tigris and the Euphrates prior to Noah's flood. All of the earth topography changed. All of the rivers changed. All of the landscape changed. Everything changed. So then why are we confused with the Tigris and Euphrates? Why did Noah name them the Tigris and the Euphrates, or whoever did? Well, it's a very simple thing, but people tend to name things, names that they're familiar with. Whenever man moves, you tend to find those names going with man. Let me give you a couple of for instances. Have you ever heard of Birmingham? Well, wait, is it Birmingham, England? Or is it Birmingham, Alabama? Because people from England immigrated to the United States and carried the name with them. How about Boston? Would that be Boston, England? Or would that be Boston, Massachusetts?
Or New York.
Or York. That's right. We take the New England. New England is not a New England, okay, but they carried that name with it. Interestingly enough, if we were in England today, traveling around the countryside, we would discover an area that was settled by some people that immigrated to the United States, apparently didn't like it, went back, and named their town California in England. So it does not seem unusual to me that when Noah and his family got out of the ark, and there were two great rivers, they stopped, rested on the Ararat Mountains, and there were two great rivers that they would have used names that they were familiar with prior to the flood. Why reinvent names, or why come up with something? The Tigris and the Euphrates, they picked two of those four names that they would have been very familiar with before that time. And so that's a very logical thing to happen, in my opinion. Now, I want to come back to the text, because on day 3, we have the creation of vegetation. After the water is gathered together into one place, and by default, if the water is gathered into one place, then the land is also gathered into one place. The second thing that happens on day 3 is that the land produces vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their kind. And the word kind just becomes a very, very important word for us to understand. We're going to talk about today, and I'm going to give you a very simple understanding of kind that's going to make a lot of sense to you. And then when we get to the creation of animals, we're going to understand that kinds were created then. And then when you go to the story of Noah and the ark and the flood, and people wonder, how did Noah get 2 of every species on the ark? The Bible does not say that Noah took 2 of every species on the ark. Well, first of all, he took 2s, okay? He basically took 7 pairs of almost everything on the ark, 7 pairs of clean animals, or animals that were fit for sacrifice, and then a single pair, 2 of unclean animals. But it's 2s and it's 7s is what we're being told. So the understanding is that it's always in pairs. When he took 7 of a kind, he did not take 1 male and 5 females, or 6 females. He took 7 pairs onto the ark, but they were always kinds, not species. Species is actually a modern word that doesn't really mean anything, in all honesty. But the Bible uses the word kinds. And it becomes very, very important for us to understand what a kind is. In the Hebrew, the word kind is min, and it refers very specifically to animals within a category, or plants within a category. What we're going to see today is plants within that category. Now I want you to understand that we believe that there was no death prior to the fall of man. So then people will sometimes ask me questions, well, what about plants? And if animals were vegetarian, didn't they eat the plants, and didn't the plants die? What about trees? Well, first of all, what we understand is that there was no death involving anything that had the breath of God in it, or that was a living soul. The Hebrew word breath of God or soul is the word nephesh. Man has nephesh, the breath of God. Animals have nephesh, they have the breath of God. plants are actually not living souls. They are not living beings. And while we call plants alive, because it's basically the way that you determine whether it's mine or Joyce, is whether it's alive or dead.
That's
okay?
right. That's very true.
And we use that word alive and the word dead, okay? But it means something different to a plant than it does to an animal. So a min is a kind, and plants are non-nephesh machines in a way. I'm going to explain that a little bit more, but we looked at over the last couple of weeks, I can't remember, I've lost track of the week, but we looked at the Hebrew word for creation being bara, B-A-R-A. And so Christian scientists that have studied this have put the two words together and have come up with what's called barminology. Barminology means the study of created kinds. God made plants according to their kinds. So the study of created kinds. There's a lot of research that's going on that today, and amazing things are being discovered. Now, most plants are hermaphrodites, which basically means that the flower of the plant is the reproductive organ of the plant. And the plants contain both the male and the female parts in order to bear seed, bear fruit, and reproduce. So a hermaphrodite then self-pollinates. You don't need two, you only need one, and it can bear seeds and self-pollinate, and more plants come from that. Different from the animal kingdom that takes a male and a female. Plants are biological machines. They have a specific purpose on the earth, but they are without life in the biblical sense of life. There is no nephesh in them. There is no breath of God in them. They do not have a soul. And so the death of a plant is not the same as the death of an animal. Now, verse 11 tells us that God created kind of three different categories of plants. There was vegetation. The King James uses the word grass. There were herbs. The King James uses the word plants. And then there were trees, same in the King James. So three categories. We have vegetation, which would be largely the grasses, the underbrush of the earth. There were the herbs, which are the plants, all the bushes, all that kind of thing on earth. And then there are the trees that we well know. So what exactly then is a kind? God creating them according to their kind. Well, groups of living organizations belong to the same created kind if they have descended from the same ancestral gene pool. Okay? A kind are the descendants from the same gene pool. That does not preclude new species because speciation basically represents a partitioning of the original gene pool. In the process of partitioning the gene pool, information is lost. Information is never gained. That flies in the face of evolution. That basically says information has to be gained. Genetic information has to be acquired as time goes on. Well, that is scientifically impossible for that to happen. Every time we make a new species of something, and every year there's 2 or 3 new kinds of dog breeds, all that is a partitioning off of another group of genes, and to make a specialty dog of some sort with length of hair, color of hair, size, web feet versus non-web feet, all kinds of different. All dogs are descend from the same kind that were on the ark, that contained that genetic gene pool that when they came off of the ark, all dogs, all canines Foxes, wolves, dingoes, all of these things came from that same gene pool. So a kind is anything that shares an ancestral gene pool. God created vegetation according to its kind. And here is something that I find absolutely fascinating. I like vegetables. I'm a vegetable eater. And I love broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi. A lot of you maybe have never heard of kohlrabi. I like those vegetables. Do you want to know something? God didn't create broccoli. God didn't create cabbage. God didn't create cauliflower. God created a kind, and it was called mustard. All of those plants come from the mustard plant. It's genetic selection on the part of people that work with these things. So they are able to take particular parts of the genes, the genetic information, and specialize that. So when God created wild mustard, God created wild mustard with this genetic bank within it that could be specialized. And we have specialized it, and there are many other vegetables that come from the wild mustard that we don't eat in this country. But all of these things have developed out of the wild mustard. So it's a kind. Now, understand that when you take a wild mustard and you separate out, you do genetic selection, and you separate out the genes that cause the flowers to turn into cauliflower, you have not gained information. You have lost information. You have specialized the information, but you have lost all of the information that was in the parent, the wild mustard. You cannot take a cabbage and turn it into a wild mustard. But you can take wild mustard and develop out of it cabbage. You lose information with the subgroups that come along. But wild mustard is a min. God created plants according to their min, according to their kind. This one becomes such a good practical lesson for us. I got to tell you that the first place I ran across this, and I've since, I was into this long before there was an Answers in Genesis, I think, or other creation groups. But I actually ran across some information from, what's the liberal college out in California? Berkeley, in their evolution class, Evolution 101. And the chart that I have here is actually a chart that I first saw. I made that one, but they have one very, very similar that they use, and they use this to explain evolution. It doesn't explain evolution; it works against them because it goes the wrong way. Now, if you could keep developing something that was smarter and smarter and had a bigger and bigger gene pool, okay, but it's not doing that. We are losing genetic information. By the way. Sometimes I hear people say that I believe in evolution, but I only believe in evolution within a species. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't believe in evolution at all. This is not evolution. This is genetic selection. In nature, there is natural genetic selection. There are environments within nature that allowed certain parts of the genes within the parent to develop in certain environments, but not in others. So that kinds developed within nature, or subspecies developed within nature out of a kind because in some places there was not enough water, or in some places there was too much water. In one of the things that I always found interesting in Alaska is something that grows on the beach in the sand is a beach pea. A beach pea, just like peas in your garden. And I used to like to go down and sit and just smell those because they smelled like fresh peas growing back in the Midwest. I loved that. It's a kind. It's a kind. And it developed to be able to handle, number one, the salt of the ocean washing up over it. And so it developed with its toleration of salt, its toleration of the sand, and various, and the toleration of Alaska, okay? All kinds of interesting things came out of that. So we see this kind of speciation, this kind of selection happening naturally in the world. All oak trees probably come from the same kind. And I'm not saying that God didn't create all kinds of different oaks, but within the oak tree is the genetic information for kinds to develop out of that. And this illustration of wild mustard becomes so very, very clear to us. Now, that is so important when we get into the creation of animals to understand kinds. Because when Noah went on the ark then, he took animals according to its kind. He didn't need foxes and wolves and dogs and other canine animals. He just needed a kind. And out of that kind then came the development, the selection as we know it today. So, baraminology, the study of created kinds. God on day 3 created vegetation according to his kind. So that's the first 3 days of creation. God made the heavens and the earth on day 1. God separated the waters with the expanse between them on day 2. And then God had the dry land and the gathered waters come into a single place on day 3. And God put vegetation on that dry land. I have to say a word before I move on to day 4 about my favorite tree in all the world, I guess. I find it interesting that we, humanity, cannot date any living thing older than 6,000 years on Earth. Nothing is alive that is older than 6,000 years. The oldest tree known on Earth is a tree named Methuselah, and it grows in California. It's a bristlecone pine tree, grows in the White Mountains of California, and it has been dated at 4,850 years old, which I find absolutely fascinating because that's within 300 years or so of the flood. But there's no other living piece of vegetation on Earth that is older than the Methuselah tree. There is nothing that we can trace on Earth. There is no living thing, no plant, no tree that we can find on Earth that is older than 6,000 years that we believe the Earth has been here since creation. And it would seem that had there really not been a creation as we know and believe, and had there not been a flood as we know and believe, that we would have some evidences of some things that are older than that, and we do not. So, moving on to day 4. And day 4, it gets a little bit complicated. On day 4, the Bible tells us that God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse," or in the expansion of the sky, to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. I think last week I mentioned that when it's talking about seasons, we're talking about appointed times, and that really is an observation of God's holy days. The purpose of the sun, the moon, the stars is to remind us of the Passover season in the springtime, and the atonement season in the fall time that the Jews would celebrate in time. That's the idea that we're getting, to show us the appointed times. Not the seasons as we think of the 4 seasons, although certainly the rotation of the earth and the tipping back and forth of the earth and all that does create the seasons for us, but it's not specifically what the Bible is telling us here. So God made 2 lights. Don't you find it interesting that God made 2 lights, a greater light and a lesser light, but neither of the lights are named? God did not give a name to any of them. Nor did God give a name to any of the stars. As a matter of fact, the simplicity of this is amazing when you look at it, because it says God said in verse In verse 16, God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. Did you see the simplicity of that? He just also made the stars.
We haven't changed the words in our song.
To what?
Well, because it says, and he called them by name. He put the stars in the skies and called them by name.
Yeah, he didn't call them by name. But notice that, and he also made the stars, is kind of almost, it seems like almost an afterthought. It's almost like it's saying God made two great lights, a greater light and a lesser light. Oh yeah, and by the way, he made the stars too. We read in the Psalms that God put the stars in space with his fingers. This is finger work for God. It's bringing that out. This is no problem. A greater light, a lesser light. Oh yeah, the stars. Finger work. It was a simple thing for God. Why is it so simplistically put together there for us? Here's what I think. I think that man, from the beginning of time, has always had the tendency to worship the creation rather than the Creator. And God doesn't even bother naming these things. It's almost incidental, because it's not about the sun, the moon, and the stars. It's about God. It's about God's creation. And we got to keep that straight. We got to keep that right, that it's not about the thing out there. It's about the wonder of God that put the sun there, that put the moon there. Now, we talked about the framework hypothesis. Do you remember the framework hypothesis when we were looking at different theories of creation? And the framework hypothesis basically looks at the 6 days of creation as if they're stanzas of a poem with 1 and 4 basically saying the same thing in just a different way. On day 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was void and dark, and the Spirit hovered, and God said, "Let there be light." On day 4, God creates a greater and a lesser light. And so the framework hypothesis people are saying is telling us the same thing. It's not talking about a 24-hour day. It's not even talking about 6 distinct different days. It's just the way that it's putting it together for us. Light, light. Then we have land, and we have vegetation. Okay, and so they show a correlation between those, saying basically it's poetic in its nature. That it's two different ways of stating the same thing. The theory, the framework hypothesis theory, basically believes that Genesis 1 is a polemic written against paganism in Babylon. Now, a polemic is a defense of the truth, okay? And so these people believe that Genesis 1 wasn't even written until Israel was carried away into captivity 600 years BC into Babylon. And that during that time, because the Babylonians worshipped the sun and the moon and the stars in a way, and believed in polytheism, a multitude of gods, that the Jews sat down and put together this polemic, arguing that creation was something that occurred by one single, only God. And so these people see this as just an argument against a false doctrine out there. They believe that Genesis was written in Babylon when the nation of Israel was there in captivity, and it was not written by Moses. But Jesus, by the way, believed that Genesis was written by Moses. And so it was written both as a polemic and as an allegory, not to be literal. The story of Adam and Eve being thrown out of the Garden of Eden is actually the story of Israel being thrown out of their land, the promised land, and being taken captivity. These people, the framework hypothesis people, believe that Adam is not a real person. He's just an allegory for Israel. Eden is not a real place, just an allegory for the promised land. Now, I have to say this. I have to say that I agree with this part of it. that Genesis 1 is a polemic against paganism. I'll go that far. It's a polemic against paganism. Because I believe Genesis 1 is the truth. That God, a single God, and an only God, is the creator God. And I think that's a good argument against paganism right there. There are not many gods. There's one God. Evolution is not true. God created. It's a good polemic. Okay? But to go as far as the framework hypothesis people, I think is ridiculous. Because basically, think about this. Doesn't a polemic against paganism lose its punch if it's not true? If it's a made-up fairy tale, doesn't it lose its punch as an argument against false teaching? It is false teaching itself. So it's not an allegory to defend what Israel believed. It is God's word, and it is God's truth. In Near Eastern religion and philosophy, okay, they worship the sun and the moon. To this very day, they worship the sun and the moon. And it's certainly easy to see how the enemy deceived them into a false worship. Because you can see the sun, and you can see the moon, and they're big, and they're majestic, and the sun is so very important to us, and the sun gives us life. And so the devil came along and convinced people all through the ages that that is God. But Romans 1:25 tells us that man worshiped the created rather than the creator. And that's exactly what we see in Middle East religions, okay? The moon causes monthly tide cycles. It has a very strong effect on what goes on the earth and the weather on the earth. And so the enemy used that, okay, to lead people astray. I think, with that in mind, the Bible does not name them because they are not to be worshipped, because they are not what are significant. These are created things. And Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." The point of the sun and the moon, and oh, by the way, God made the stars too, is God made them. God created them, made for our benefit. They are lights for the day. They are lights for the night. They are signs for the seasons. They establish the days. I know I mentioned this, but I want to say it again. Our day, 24-hour day, comes from the rotation of the earth over a 24-hour period. Our months come from the moon circling the earth in roughly a 30-day period. Our year comes from the earth circling the sun in a 365 and a fourth day period of time. But the week comes only from God. There is no natural reason to have a 7-day week. There is a 24-hour day, there is a 30-day month, there is a 365-day year, but there is no logical reason to have a 7-day week. And in all the world, all the people of the world celebrate a 7-day week. And it's because God said, this is what a week is going to be. God worked for 6 days, rested on the 7th, and said that man should do the same. So, God set the sun and the moon and the stars in the firmament. Very simplistic language that is used in this whole section, verse 14, 15, 16, 17. Psalm 147:4. Psalm 147:4 said, God counts the number of stars. He gives names to them all. Okay? So
we can leave it in.
Yeah, but we don't know what they are. But he didn't tell us. Okay? Do you know how many stars there are? Me either. But here's what I do know. Astronomers estimate that the observable universe has 100 billion galaxies. 100. I don't even know what 100 billion anything is. I understand our galaxy. I don't understand the immensity of our galaxy. But there's 100 billion, I don't know who counted them, but that's what they estimate. Our Milky Way, according to astronomers, has somewhere between 300 and 400 billion stars in it. And there's 300, 400 billion stars in the Milky Way, and there's 100 billion more galaxies out there. About 9,000 stars are visible with the naked eye, not necessarily from San Antonio. But if you've ever been up in the mountains where the air is clean and there's no light, it's absolutely awesome to gaze into the heavens. About 9,000 stars are visible with the naked eye. About 200,000 stars with a decent pair of binoculars. 200,000. A small telescope, you can see about 15 million stars. And Psalm 8:3 says, God did that with his fingers. He did it with his fingers. And so somebody worships a star instead of the God who put it there with his fingers. The scripture is wanting us to come to God. Not come to the stars, not to the moon. Come to God. So, there are lots of creation myths. Creation myths. I find what evolutionary scientists say to be absolutely fascinating, folks. And I got to share some of it with you, okay? The Big Bang. Just the belief in the Big Bang. Heather Cooper is a scientist and an author, of children's books. In a book that she published entitled The Big Bang, she says, concerning the Big Bang, it was a nothing so profound it defies human comprehension. Science.
Something does.
Yeah.
Science is observation and experimentation to gain knowledge. But she says the Big Bang was a nothing so profound it defies human comprehension. That does not sound like a scientific statement to me, does it to you? Brad Lemley, a scientific author, has written for many science magazines and used to work for the Washington Post, I believe. In an article, Science for the Curious Discoverer, in a magazine, Science for the Curious Discoverer, he says, to the average person, it might seem obvious that nothing can happen in nothing. But to the quantum physicist, nothing is in fact something. Now, I know my mom believed that, because she would say, Russell, what are you doing? Nothing. Okay, but we're talking about a child here, okay? Brad Lemley's talking apparently as an adult, as a sane, intelligent adult. To the average person, it might seem obvious that nothing can happen in nothing, but to the quantum physicist, nothing is in fact something. That does not sound like a scientific statement to me. I think he's on to say in that same article, quantum theory also holds that a vacuum, like atoms, is subject to quantum uncertainties. This means, he says, that things can materialize out of a vacuum, although they tend to vanish back into it quickly. This phenomenon has never been observed directly. Let me translate that for you. Things appear out of nothing. They disappear back into nothing. And oh, by the way, nobody ever saw it happen. That doesn't sound like a scientific statement to me. It's a statement of belief, folks. These are statements of belief. They are not statements of science. When I say that creation has a theology, there's a theology of creation, there's not a science of creation. Because science is observation and experimentation that leads to knowledge. You cannot observe creation, you cannot experiment with creation, and so there is no body of knowledge that comes from science for creation, but there is a theology of creation. Back to Heather Cooper. She says our universe probably came into existence not only from nothing, but from nowhere. Did she see that? How do you see nothing? How do you see nowhere? How can something come from nothing and nowhere?
Out of nowhere.
You know what? You know why these beliefs are accepted? Because people don't want to acknowledge there is a God.
That's right.
Because if you acknowledge there's a God, now you have to acknowledge that you are answerable to God. And that's uncomfortable. People don't want to do that. So, the whole thing of evolution comes out of atheism, a denial of the Creator who made us to be in communication with Him. Acts 17:23 says, For I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples made by human hands. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now He commands all people everywhere to repent. The idea that God is not in charge, or not existent, or not the Creator, are not statements of science. They are statements of belief. And I got to tell you that they are statements of, I sure hope I'm right in the end, by people who don't want to believe in the God, the Creator God of the universe, before whom they will stand one day. Science, by its own definition, the world of science and technology defines science as basically information gathered through observation and experimentation. There is no observation of creation. So Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to your care. Turn away from godless chatter and the opposing ideas of what is falsely called science. This one floors me, folks. This one floors me. This is a scientist by the name of Jeremy Rifkin. And he's writing in an article called Humans, Not God, Make the Rules Now. Listen to this. We no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home, and therefore obliged to make our behavior conform with a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. It is our creation now. We make the rules. We establish the perimeters of reality. We create the world. And because we do, we no longer feel beholden to outside forces. We no longer have to justify our behavior, for we are now the architects of the universe. We are responsible to nothing outside of ourselves, for we are the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever.
And where were you
That
when I made the foundations of the earth?
is allegedly the voice of a scientist. That is not the statement of science. That is a statement of blasphemy. To misuse the Lord's Prayer. So, a couple of things I want to talk about. Number one, sometimes we hear that the Big Bang Theory is proven. It's not a theory. It's a fact. Okay, and I want you to understand that I'm going to talk about a problem that evolutionists have because I want to show you that they have a problem, and then I'm going to show you that creationists have a problem too. Okay, so one of their big problems is what's called the cosmic microwave background radiation problem. Okay, it's a big title, but let me explain it very simply. It was discovered in 1965 that there is actually heat in the universe. Now, don't ask me how they discovered this, because I don't understand that, okay? I read the reports and I understand the conclusion, but I don't understand the process. But they discovered that there is heat in the universe. that there, everywhere in the universe there are stray atoms, and the universe is not, as previously thought, a perfect vacuum. In a perfect vacuum, there's going to be no heat because there's nothing to hold heat. But they discovered that there are atoms at various points throughout the universe, and that the temperature of the universe is not absolute zero. Now, absolute zero, I'm sure you don't know this, and I have to look it up on a regular basis. Absolute zero, there's a scale called the Kelvin scale, and the absence of all heat on the Kelvin scale is zero. That's considered absolute zero. How cold is absolute zero? 459.67 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Okay, so in round numbers, 460 degrees below zero is absolute zero. You can't get colder than no heat, the existence of no heat. Here's the problem. Absolute zero does not occur in the universe, but actually there is a temperature in the universe of 2.75 degrees on the Kelvin scale. Now that's not much heat. That's very, very little, but it's significant in that it is there. So the universe is very cold, but not as cold, but not absolute cold. Okay. So here's the problem for the Big Bang people. The Big Bang theorists say that the temperature of the universe is left over from the explosion of the Big Bang. They say when the bang occurred, there was heat that was manifested from the bang, and therefore the temperature in deep space is left over from that Big Bang, okay? But the problem is that Big Bang people say that the universe is somewhere between 13 and 15 billion years old. Now, how does heat travel? Heat travels through infrared light rays. How fast does infrared light travel? 186,000 miles per second. If you do the math, the universe is too big for heat to have traveled through it in that length of time. And Big Bang theory people have a hard time explaining the existence of heat in deep, deep outer space that is beyond the distance that infrared light could have traveled in the length of time that they say the universe existed. Now, I just offer that to you. I'm not going to solve their problem. By the way, I got to tell you that they have come up with a solution, an answer to it. And this is it, okay? What they say is that that in the first billionth of a second after the Big Bang, the universe expanded very rapidly, and then starting with the third billionth of a second after the Big Bang, it all slowed down to its current rate of expansion. How'd you figure that out? Okay, now, not to make too much fun of them, because we have our own problems. And this is where I really want to go with this. I want you to understand we're not the only ones with problems. Evolutionists have their problems. But here's our problem. It's called a distant starlight problem. A distant starlight problem. How, if the Earth and the universe is 6,000 years old, how did light get from millions and millions of light years away to us, so that we can see the light from stars today if we're really only 6,000 years old? And that's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. There are some theories, but the starlight problem in a nutshell. When do you see something happen in the universe? Do you see it when it really happens? Or do you see it when the light finally gets to you millions and millions of years after it really happened? Or let me throw this one in. Maybe it didn't even really happen. You're just seeing something God put out there that didn't really happen, but it's just the evidence of it. When did it happen? Well, In 1987, there was a supernova. And if you understand what a supernova is, basically a supernova is a star that is used up, it burns out, and it explodes. It looks something like this. It's a star that explodes, and when it explodes, it puts this ring out around it, and then what you see, the sparkly stuff coming at us, that's gases escaping from that star that exploded. That's a supernova. Now, when did that supernova happen? In 1987, the last observable supernova occurred in the universe. It was named by scientists as supernova 1987A. They named it the A just in case there would happen to be another supernova in the same year. It happened in November, and there was not another one in the same year. With that in mind, scientists were able to gauge the distance to that star at 168,000 light years away. So, did it happen 168,000 years ago and the light just finally got to us in 1987? Or how did the light get here? How does light travel that far for young Earth people that believe everything was created 6,000 years ago? Do you see the dilemma? How do we answer that? Well, there are several different theories, and those are what I'm going to take a moment to share with you. They are called distant starlight problem theories, okay? Theory number one is the mature starlight theory. Basically, the mature starlight theory says, here we have the Earth, and out here we have stars, hundreds of thousands and millions of light years away. And that when God created the universe, He created the universe mature, so He not only put those stars hundreds of thousands and millions of light years away, but He put the light trail in place at the same time. It's a good theory, and it's certainly, I think it's a notable theory, and I think it's possible. That when God created the universe, He created the universe mature, so that everything was there. The one issue that I have, then, is that if I have a supernova that's 186,000 light years away, then God put the story in the light, but it never really happened. You understand that? Okay, if it's 186,000 miles away, light years away, and these stars, and God put the star there, and He put the light there, so He put the whole thing there, then God put the light for something that could not have happened, because it would have had to have happened within the last 6,000 years, but it's 186,000 light years away. So God put the story of the supernova in the light without it ever having really happened. I have a little bit of a problem with that, because from my perspective, that seems a little bit deceptive on God's part, okay? But nevertheless, there's a lot of Christians that believe in the mature starlight theory, that God created a mature universe, and all these stories, all these light stories and everything are there, they're all in place. That's theory number one. Theory number two is called the CDK model. CDK. I like CDK because it's CDK is how you see it when you look it up. But it actually stands for the decay of C. Okay? C is light. You remember Einstein? E equals mc squared. E is energy, mass, light squared. So the CDK model is this. Maybe the speed of light has deteriorated over time. So that 6,000 years ago, when God created the heavens and the earth, the speed of light was way, way faster than 186,000 miles per second. And that over time, light has slowed down to where it is today, but it was not the case at creation. Possibly. Again, that would fall to me into the category of there's no science for this, because there's absolutely no way of knowing that happened, except that there is some science that would relate to it, okay? And basically, radioactive decay rates depend on the speed of light. And if the speed of light is going way, way faster in times before than it is today, then all of a sudden the radioactivity rates on Earth would be such that life could never have existed here. And so that would have been a problem, okay? But the CDK model is one of the ways that Christians try to explain this light thing. Number 3 is what's called the alternate synchrony model. Now this one gets really interesting because this is put together by Dr. Jason Lisle. The alternate synchrony model basically says that time passes differently in different parts of the universe. Here's what we know, that with the absence of gravity, time moves slower than it does in the presence of gravity. And we can measure this scientifically. We can measure this. It has nothing to do with the mechanics of a chronometer or a clock. It has nothing to do with the mechanics of it. If clocks are synchronized, there's no mechanical issue when you have a clock in gravity and a clock outside of gravity. The two clocks move at a different rate of time. Interestingly enough, if you have two spaceships traveling parallel side by side with a chronometer in each one, those chronometers will synchronize. But if you have two spaceships moving toward each other and past each other, so there's velocity but no gravity, now the fact that they are moving in opposite directions of each other, the chronometers do not synchronize. Time moves differently. What does that mean? That means if somehow we could send somebody hundreds of millions of light years out into space, they could come back and be younger over the same period of time than the person who stayed here. That was one of Einstein's beliefs, one of his theories. We can measure time in a spaceship outside of gravity, and we know that gravity and velocity have an effect on time. Therefore, the alternate synchrony model says that time passes differently at different parts of the universe based on velocity and based on gravity. Here's the problem. You can't measure it. You can't measure it. Somehow you would have to have a synchronization between two chronometers. And if you had one chronometer over there, and then you move that chronometer over here, the mere fact that you have moved a chronometer changes the time. It alters the time, okay? So it's a non-measurable thing. It's an interesting theory, but it's non-measurable, okay? The final one is what's called gravitational time dilation. This was developed by a man by the name of Dr. Russell Humphreys. And I find it to be an absolutely fascinating one. Now remember, we're talking about how does light get from millions of light years away to here in a 6,000 year period of time. The Big Bang Theory has two assumptions. Assumption number 1, that the universe is infinite in size. And number 2, that Einstein's theories of relativity are correct. Now here's what I believe. I believe, number 1, that the universe is not infinite in size, that it has boundaries. As a matter of fact, an outer boundary happens to be a sea. So I believe that there are boundaries within the universe. So that part I can't agree with. Secondly, whether Einstein's theories are correct or not, I don't know for sure, but I do find them interesting and worth thinking about. So only God is infinite, and the universe is not. But could it be that the universe has a boundary, and that boundary is expanding. And when we read in the Bible that God put the sun, the moon, the greater light, the lesser light, and the stars in the expanse, or in the expansion, that now all of a sudden we have a whole different situation going on, and we have a combination of distance and time variation. So think about it like this. If God created the universe and everything in it, and then, remember we looked at this verse last week, God stretched the universe. Remember the word that's used in the Hebrew is the idea of pounding it out and stretching it. God unfolded it like a tent, opened it like a curtain, stretched it out like a curtain, the Bible tells us. And so the universe began to stretch. Now I drew a spiral, but just stretched out in every direction. All of a sudden, we have a whole different dimension of understanding that's going on in the universe. It's something that looks like this. If God made the earth, and then God made the universe and the stars, and then God stretched this out. Then what do we have? Then we don't have a situation where light has to get from here to here because it went the other way. Because God put it here and stretched it out. So all of a sudden, we have an expanding of the universe. And in an expanding of the universe, the light trail that is left behind from that, so that the light really only had to get from there to Earth, and that's 6,000 years, but the universe was way smaller before God stretched it out. And that when we have a supernova that explodes out here, it exploded here, and God stretched it. Seems to me that's what the Bible's saying. That's what the firmament, the expanse, or the expansion is all about. God created the heavens and the earth. And then God separated the water from below from the water above. And in the expansion, He placed the stars, the sun and the moon and the stars. And that expansion is continuing to expand to this very day. And science tells us that the universe is getting bigger. I don't know how they can believe, number one, that it's infinite, and number two, that it's expanding. They can figure that problem out on their own. But they tell us that we know that everything is moving in all of the universe. So all of a sudden, we have a whole different situation. Now, the other thing that we know is that not only does the Bible seem to talk about the expansion of the universe, but then in addition to that, we have the whole time, velocity, gravitational variation issue. So that with the absence of gravity and the movement of the expanding universe, what looks like took millions and millions and millions and millions of years happened in the space of 6 days. The 6 days of creation. Einstein's theory supports this, and the Bible supports this, in my opinion. In my opinion, I hold to this view. I believe that God created the heavens and the earth and the universe. Remember, there's not a Hebrew word for universe, and expanded that creation. And that's how we have light from millions and millions of light years away that reaches the earth in only a 6,000 year period of time. An expansion of the universe. I like the idea that light didn't have to get from here to here. The star got from here to here and went the other way and left the light trail behind it. So let me wrap it up. The main purpose of the creation of the universe, despite all the theories, is found in Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Ultimately, let me say this. How did light get from way out there to here? I don't know. I don't know. It did. It does. I believe what God said, that he created in 6 days. I believe the time frame that the Bible lays out, that the earth is about 6,000 years old. And while to me the gravitational time dilation theory answers it to my contentment, I don't know that that's right. I don't know that I need to know. God did it. It is so. And the heavens declare the glory of God. The fact that the universe is filled with mystery does not hurt my faith. It helps my faith, because my God is a God of mystery. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 40 and 41, it says, there are also celestial bodies and terrestrial bodies. But the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars. For one star differs from another star in glory. So there's different glory for earth than there is for the heavens. There's a different glory from the moon to the glory of the sun, to the glory of the stars. They are all different from each other. But they all proclaim the glory of God. They are signs of a creator. They are signs of the wonder, the magnificence, the power, the authority of God's spoken word. Let there be, and there was. And it was evening, and it was morning, the third day, and now the fourth day.